Dmitry from Hardware Canucks got a whole lot of hate for switching back to Intel from Ryzen in his video talking about the new Intel hardware acceleration in Adobe Premiere. And to a very large extent, it pretty much proves the point that the blind fanboyism is just completely deprived of any kind of logic. It's bereft of any logical ability to look at data and agree that, yes, for his use case, it made sense to do what he was doing. And today we're actually validating some of that testing, not for any other reason than we've been looking at building a new rendering rig. And at the end of the day, Dmitry makes different types of videos than us, so we might have different needs. We thought it's worth running some of the similar tests with the IGP hardware acceleration to see if it makes sense to go with a $1,000+ CPU or a $300 one with an IGP that would otherwise never be used. So that's what we're doing today. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly's high-end thermal paste and liquid metal. Thermal Grizzly's Cryonaut is an affordable, high-quality thermal compound that doesn't face some of the aging limitations of other pastes on the market. Cryonaut has a thermal conductivity of 12.5 watts per meter Kelvin, focuses on endurance, is easy to spread, and isn't electrically conductive, making it safe to use on GPU dies. Thermal Grizzly also makes Conductonaut liquid metal, which we've used to drop 20 degrees off some temperatures in our delidded tests. Buy a tube at the link in the description below. So for these tests, we're looking at Adobe Premiere encoding and rendering exclusively. There are obviously use cases for high core count CPUs. Look at Blender, we've done those tests. It's not the point today. It's not the point to try and make your favorite $1,000+ CPU, Intel or AMD, look good. The point is, we're doing this for ourselves, selfishly, to figure out what we need. And if you happen to be someone who does a lot of video editing and production, maybe your videos are similar to ours in some ways, this data should be comparable for you so you can figure out what's the best choice for your build if you're working with Adobe Premiere primarily. And obviously, if you're working with things like Blender, you have more stuff to consider. But for Adobe Premiere, they got an update recently. It's one of the few updates from Adobe that doesn't instantly cause crashing and freezes and all kinds of fun features. And in fact adds IGP utilization on the CPU. So if you have an integrated graphics processor on an Intel CPU, i.e. an 8700K, then Premiere can now leverage that in rendering to accelerate the rendering, just like it can leverage CUDA, and it can actually do both at the same time. It's actually very interesting because we've been looking at using a 6900K for a new system build we wanted to do, but 8700K might actually be better. And it's easier to get in terms of, it's cheaper and it's worth less on our shelf than a high-end CPU. So these are 100% real videos we're testing with today. These are videos that we actually made in the last week or so, rendered in their entirety and uploaded. And we're using 4K videos for the most part, but we have one 1080 video, and that's a BuildZoid video a VRM analysis we uploaded. So there's an interesting thing here in that having the significantly reduced pixel count with a 1080 video versus a 4K video has actually serious implications for rendering performance. So if you're doing video editing for your own YouTube channel or whatever, and you do 1080, maybe 1080-60 like we do instead of 4K, then the numbers are not going to be the same as 4K numbers for rendering. They leverage different parts of the hardware in different ways. And also, we noted a couple of interesting things where GPU usage is significantly higher in our videos where we have charts being drawn. So actually in this video, you'll see some charts. When those are on the screen, the CPU usage plummets during rendering, and the GPU usage goes up a lot. As an example, with Threadripper, and we'll show this later, 1950X, we saw CPU utilization in a dual encode, meaning two videos simultaneously, drop from 100% during A-roll, which is this right now. This is A-roll, where I'm on camera. It was 100% with that. And that's with color correction and other small effects, maybe some transforms, but mostly color correction and just A-roll, which is a lot of pixels. So 100% usage, and then a chart pops up, and now CPU utilization on the 1950X was 43%, but GPU usage went up from 40 to 88%, and that's on the CUDA accelerated 1080 Ti, so no IGP there. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about, where usage matters, and Dmitry certainly had a point to switch to Intel for his use case. I frankly don't fully understand all of the hate they got for that specific video. It's not like it was a vacuum video. It was him switching platforms because it worked better for him. And honestly, the intense love of the downvote button on anything where someone's like, I'm switching from X CPU to Y CPU, is mind-blowing. The fact that people can't look past their sheer blind fanboyism, which by itself is mind-boggling to even have that mentality, to see that, yes, this particular individual is better served by another component than the component that I personally like. I don't know how we get there, but it's really just perplexing to see. I really truly don't get it, and honestly, it's stupid. If you have that mentality, it's a very bad one. You should get rid of it. So let's move on. G5600 review is the first one. This is a review of a CPU we did recently. It is the entire review, so it gives us an idea of how long it takes to render an actual review video that we make, which is, again, for our selfish purposes of figuring out what we're going to use in the future for rendering machines. So we'll start with a rendering of our Intel G5600 review. It's a 16-minute video that uses color correction and adaptive noise reduction. The Intel i7-8700K isn't impressive when looking at the older method of software rendering and proves to be the slowest of all the CPUs tested. The stock 8700K takes 46 minutes, or about 12% longer than the R7-2700X stock CPU, and when overclocked to 5 GHz, it's still at 43 minutes. An 8% reduction in time required, but still slower than even a stock 2700X. Using hardware encoding pushes work to the IGP, which is typically left completely unused when leaning on a DGPU for CUDA acceleration, and also even when you're not, even just software accelerated, before this update, it didn't do anything. Integrated graphics processors in the 8700K accelerate the rendering to 32 to 33 minutes, a reduction of 30% in time required to render. This is also 20% shorter in render duration than the 2700X stock CPU, resulting in a complete shuffling of the leaderboard. For high-end parts, specifically for purposes of our rendering workstations, this is basically invalidating both the Threadripper 1950X and the Intel i9-7980XE. Technically speaking, both are faster than an 8700K, but not proportionately to their price. The 1950X is functionally equivalent in render time, with stock-to-stock differences totaling 3 minutes against a 33-minute render, so about 8 to 10-ish%. Sure, it's an uplift, but it's not worth the extra money if only using Premiere on the system. The 7980XE is even worse in value. Overclocking to 4.6 GHz, which is our max supported overclock on a 280 cooler, allows us to finish the render in 24.5 minutes. If we wanted to pull 700 watts from the wall and stick a 360mm radiator with loud fans on it, we could push 4.9 GHz, but it just would not be worth it, and it's not really a good fit for 24/7 use at all. Either way, stock, the 30-minute completion time isn't worth the $2,000 plus cost, not counting the platform. The 8700K blows all of this away and is a clear performer when it has the IGP enabled for a 4K 60 video review, basically with some charts and a couple of other things that you can actually see. That's the cool thing about these tests. All of the rendering, all of the test cases, go watch our videos and you can see them, and also we get more views. So it's a nice feedback loop there. Definitely why we made it that way, not because it was just easier to test that way. So there's an argument to be made for just raw performance, and in a production environment, sure. I've actually argued this in the past too in our reviews. If you're a professional and you have a lot of money to spend on something, then it might make sense to go with something that's fractionally faster. Single-digit percentages? Sure. If it's a difference of $1,000, maybe that means nothing to you. But here's the thing. This is our production environment we're talking about, so I don't really care what anyone else is using the CPUs for. Keep that in mind. For our production environment, we do have budgets to consider. Contrary to popular belief, I don't just get any CPU I want from any vendor all the time. The 7980XE we have, the 1950X we have, they have to stay in the CPU tray for further testing, for benchmarking, for content. That's more important than putting them in a machine. So if I wanted to use one, I'd have to buy it and put it in our next rendering machine. But we're talking about single-digit percentages before overclocks in terms of advantages with those CPUs, and they're $800 or $2,000 depending. So you go with an 8700K in this instance, with the IGP, it's like 300 something bucks, and that's it. It's within single-digit percentages of a $2,000 Intel CPU. It's like Premiere has single-handedly, for this specific use case of ours, invalidated the high-end CPUs that we actually wanted to use by enabling IGP rendering. So it's awesome to see. It's kind of sad that it took so long to get this, and hopefully they can stay on this and fix things like the software not working in the future as well. Let's look at this really interesting chart next. Adobe allows users to perform simultaneous renders of outputting from the same project file, like from two separate sequences. In this use case, the high thread count CPUs show their potential benefits. We're at 46 minutes to render two files simultaneously on the 7980XE, whereas we would have taken 60 minutes if rendering them one by one on the 7980XE. And that's, refer to the previous chart for those numbers. It's 30 times 2. The 8700K has the opposite response. It takes 76 minutes on a software and hardware render, 77 minutes for dual software rendering, and 72 minutes for dual hardware or IGP rendering. In all three of these cases, it would be faster to render two files sequentially rather than two files synchronously or simultaneously on the 8700K. A single render would have taken 33 minutes, two sequential renders would have taken 66, and dual rendering takes 72 minutes on the 8700K. Easy math. This tells us something critical and gives us some insight we didn't have a moment ago. And that thing that it tells us is that a 7980XE, or a 1950X for that matter, can be faster when you're talking about rendering multiple things simultaneously. And that's an interesting use case, but not one that applies to us. So for our purposes, everything we do is sequential. We get the videos done, and it's more or less one at a time, render it, keep moving, because we don't have a whole bunch of projects to just queue up and let them rip all at once. So there is a use case there. If you do that, first of all, I'd be curious to know why. Like, what is your job that you render two things at the same time or more in the same Adobe Media Encoder window? Because that's interesting. But also, that would be a potential use case for a high-end CPU where you do actually get significant benefit from having the threads. But what this teaches us is that Adobe Media Encoder, Premiere in general, when rendering, they care far more about frequency for the most part. There's a bit of a lean on the GPU, potentially on the IGP, but frequency matters the most for our type of rendering. And having more threads, there's diminishing returns there because you do sacrifice frequency for it, unless you're doing dual or multi rendering at the same time. You're encoding multiple things at once, then yes, it does actually help to have all those threads because the frequency doesn't matter as much anymore. But if you're doing synchronous versus sequential, sequential does actually seem to care about frequency first. Next one, Buildzoid's video for us. We have a 1080p file with no effects, and it behaves a lot differently from our usual 4K correction-heavy final outputs. We used one of our Buildzoid videos for this, which is rendered at 1080p 60, a lower bitrate, and has no special effects. In this test, we observed no measurable performance improvement with hardware acceleration. There's just nothing for it to accelerate. You won't see the gains of GPU acceleration if there's nothing to use a GPU on. You'd want transforms or similar effects to get some value out of the IGP. For a straight 1080p file, even running a 7980XE or 1950X doesn't really change things meaningfully. Anyone rendering files similar to this one would not need high-end hardware or even IGP acceleration. That said, CUDA acceleration still helps and is enabled on all of these tests. Speaking of CUDA acceleration, we decided to torture ourselves just to give you an idea of how much that still matters. With CUDA acceleration disabled in our NZXT M22 review render, it took the 8700K 350 minutes, that's 5.8 hours, to render the same clip that was finished in 34 minutes with software rendering and CUDA. Using hardware rendering on the IGP, and also CUDA by the way, we brought this down further to 21 minutes, a reduction from the 34-minute prior time of 38%, and a reduction from the 350-minute time of a lot of percent. That's hands down impressive, again, and shows where we should move for our next render machine. The 2700X stays closer to 30 minutes, and the 1950X at 23 minutes, with the 7980XE at 20 minutes. Overclocking the 7980XE does get it a few minutes faster than the 8700K stock CPU with the IGP assistance, but at $2,000 versus $350, it's simply not justifiable for us. Remember, we have to keep this CPU, the i9, for benchmarking, so we'd have to buy another one for rendering. It's not worth the cost. Finally, for an Ask GN video, one of our most popular series, we measured the 8700K at 90 minutes completion for both the stock and overclocked variants when rendered without IGP assistance. Enabling the IGP brought us down to 53 and 58 minutes, not distant from the 1950X and 7980XE. This type of video is intensive on the CPU because there are very few transforms and GPU accelerated effects. It's almost entirely straight A-roll, which is specifically CPU intensive. So we're going to go over to the test bench just for a second to get some hands-on with what Premiere does and what its resource utilization looks like, just to give everyone a better idea of how it behaves these days. Then we'll come back here and do the wrap-up and conclusion with how the effects are impacted as well. So here's the 8700K now playing back one of our clips, and we can actually set this to higher quality as well. So it's doing playback right now, and if we look at Task Manager while it's playing back, what you'll see is when it's playing back a chart and it's struggling a little bit here, you see all that stutter because I'm at full quality right now, we're actually pushing the load primarily to the GPU when it actually does load up, but it's just kind of spiking all over the place, and this is indicative of some Adobe Premiere optimization issues overall, where there's really no clear single resource right now that's taking on this processing task. So let's just drop this down to a more processable speed, like half, see how that changes things. So now what we're getting is some more GPU load, and this is the Intel GPU, the IGP. So you can see this is actually at 100% load right now. The CPU is bounced between 15 and 80% depending on how much the IGP is taking up. There's some latency between these two, so you're not seeing a perfect response between them. And then CUDA acceleration is doing some of the rest. It just depends on what kind of image we're rendering presently in the playback monitor. So if we kind of jump ahead maybe to some A-roll or B-roll, which has, this one's actually slowed down, so the speed's reduced on this to smooth out the clip. And the result is the IGP is taking all the playback. And this is in real-time playback, mind you. And if this stutters, it gets really hard to do editing because, I mean, it's stuttering. So you have to constantly pause and start. Or you can drop the quality to like an 1/8, and then you end up with a really bad picture in playback where it's super grainy. So right now we can sustain a half playback to full playback on the 8700K stock, as CPU is taking a good bit of the load, the GPU on the CPU is taking the rest, and CUDA acceleration is taking some of it. Just depends on what's going on. So that gives you an idea of how each of these works. Now we're going to open up a test file with some different effects that we can toggle on and off. So here we have a clip. We can do some really simple color correction applied and disabled. And if we just do that while it's playing back, there might be a bit of impact on the components, but there's almost no impact in rendering, which happens after this. This is, again, previewing. So overall, Lumetri color just doesn't seem to impact much of anything in live playback or in rendering. There's a bit more in live playback than in rendering, though. And then we can also do a clip with some warp stabilization just for another test case. And for this one, what we'll do is take a clip that has warp stabilize applied and see if there's any impact playing back versus not applied. So instantly we're getting a lot of IGP load right now. Still like 14% CUDA load, so not a whole lot going on with CUDA acceleration. Premiere's never really properly leveraged that during preview. It uses it on and off during rendering, but yeah, lots of IGP load, not so much on the CPU. And then if we look at another example of applying warp stabilizer rather than enabling it, we can see what that load looks like, because now it's going to analyze, and this will take a long time. So it's analyzing frame by frame this entire clip to smooth it out. And over here we can see what it's doing to analyze, which appears to be not a whole lot of load on any particular resource right now. A bit on the CPU and a little bit on the IGP, but not a whole lot really on anything. So this is going to take a while, and we're not really sure what exactly is going on during this process. It might just kind of try to be a low intensive background process, and maybe that's why it takes a while. But either way, not a lot of immediate impact. Playback, though, while we warp stabilize, you'll see a lot of IGP load because that clip is warp stabilized already. So there's some basic examples for you. Just another firm reminder here, this testing could be done a lot of different ways. We're not doing it for your benefit, really. It was for our own, to see what kind of components we should upgrade to. And if your use cases happen to align with ours, hopefully some of this teaches you something along with the charts we have. Otherwise, it's mostly just for our own upgrades for the future. And finally, now back in the main set, moving on to some studies of effects, we noticed that rendering is largely unimpacted when toggling things like warp stabilizer, Lumetri color, and scales and rotates. A lot of the impact is seen in real-time playback when scrubbing the video or when analyzing the video with warp stabilizers, but doesn't seem to much challenge the render times for our benchmarks. Warp stabilization during rendering, for instance, was 4.3 minutes with software each time, or 2.2 minutes with hardware acceleration for each render. That said, the frame analysis pre-render would be more impacted than the render itself. Lumetri color showed the same thing, 5.6 versus 5.7 minutes render time with hardware acceleration, which is completely within margin of error, and that's when toggling the effect on versus off. It's about 12 minutes with software acceleration when toggled on versus off, so again, no change at all from the toggle of Lumetri color. Scale and rotate showed mostly the same. On more bound configurations, specifically GPU bound, this would start to challenge lower-end CUDA devices, but we mean very low-end here. We use a 1080 Ti for our production machine, so this is a complete non-issue for us. And for anyone wondering, there's no difference at 1080p. We won't bother with a chart for that. We tested the same things there and saw the same lack of difference. And that is how Adobe Premiere behaves, at least for our use cases. Again, a couple things here before all the especially AMD fans out there freak out and start typing in mean comments. Here's the thing. There are perfect use cases for the 1950X, for the 7980XE, for the 8700K, and for the 2700X. These renders, not really the best use case for a lot of those CPUs, for the high-end ones especially. You'd really, for the most part, sadly, be better off with an 8700K and IGP. And that's, again, for our specific type of rendering. So to give you an example of where the high-end 1950X, which is great value for the dollar, we've, again, repeatedly recommended it and have given it a lot of awards. The 1950X or the 7980XE at 2x the cost are great choices for rendering multiple things at once, or if you do other stuff than Premiere on that machine, like Blender, where you can definitely make use of all those threads. And Blender is advantaged over CUDA in some instances when you just run out of CUDA memory. So if you have a CUDA memory limitation with your project files, then having a Threadripper CPU with all the 32 threads working at once and more or less limitless RAM, 32, 64 gigabytes, that's a lot of power and a perfect use case for it. But for what we're looking at, the 8700K is a better fit for us. What we use right now, just so you know, is an X79 platform. It's several years old. And we were looking at upgrading to X99 with a 6900K because we had retired a 6900K recently and we have X99 boards. Really was looking forward to that build. Sadly, we're not going to do that build because going with a high core count Intel CPU, the 6900K, with no IGP in it is going to be worse than an 8700 with an IGP. And we can just overclock that one trivially as well. So we're going to go with 8700K for our next build, I think, is what it's looking like. Currently, our X79 platform is actually, I think it's a 24-thread system. It's a Xeon CPU, and we bought it specifically for the thread count, which has been nice for Blender, but the frequency is low enough at 3 gigahertz that for Premiere, those threads are, one, basically never utilized, and two, when they are utilized, the frequency is low enough that we don't get, I mean, it takes 2 or 3 times as long as the 8700K does to render. So it'll be a huge upgrade for us to go from X79 and a 20-something thread Xeon CPU, which is just not the right fit for Adobe Premiere, to a new one. So that's what we're looking at. There, again, if you have an AMD CPU, don't feel bad about it. There's no reason to feel buyer's remorse or anything else that you might be feeling, because they're still good CPUs. Ryzen CPUs are doing just fine. They don't have to be good at every single thing all the time. They're still good at Premiere, though. It's just that this new update makes Intel's IGP an actually advantageous thing to have, and it's not something really that I think anyone was expecting. IGP has kind of been a stupid, pointless component for the most part, but suddenly it has a use, and that's really interesting. So we'll be using an 8700K, I think, for a render machine, and we'll stick with Ryzen options for things like Blender rendering or something like that, where we have just a lot of tiles to do and we don't have the frequency concern that Premiere seems to have, or the IGP advantage. And one final thing, as a reminder, stock, the 2700X was doing better than the 8700K stock in Adobe Premiere without hardware acceleration. So up until this point, yeah, the 2700X was a pretty good choice, and there's no reason for anyone to feel bad about that now, because if you're happy with it, or if you were happy with it then, nothing's changed. It's just the 8700K is suddenly using something it wasn't before. So that's it for this one. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up one of our mod mats like this one, the anti-static building surface that's 4 feet by 2 feet, if you understand American metric system, by which I mean not the metric system. Check it out on store.gamersnexus.net. I'll see you all next time.